So apparently Sony are being forced to change everything about the way their company works, all for the PlayStation 5. Not only that, but their vision for the future, their goal of massive expansion for that ecosystem and more. There is so much to cover here. I think their PlayStation 5 master plan is quite clear. Let's get into it. What is going on, guys? Dealer back again. Thank you so much for joining me yet again as we discuss, of course, more PlayStation 5. Now, it's not my fault Sony are so vocal here lately, and today's article actually fascinates me to a degree. They are doing things they have never done, and there are so many people overlooking some of these fine details, so much so that I do believe they didn't even read this article. Obviously, we can potentially learn quite a bit about the new direction of Sony as we wait for Project Scarlet and information. Microsoft have been mighty stingy with that. Of course, there could be a strategy there, but hey, I'm hyped. I want some more information on Scarlet. Hopefully that'll change soon, but for now, we're talking more about what PlayStation are doing for the obvious reason of, hey, let's observe those guys. Maybe Microsoft might be looking at similar things. Today, we've got a particularly interesting topic given Jim Ryan. Yes, Jim Ryan is saying some interesting things about the direction Sony are taking. I mean, look at this. We had to make changes to deliver our PlayStation 5 dream. Now look, one thing is very apparent after reading this article. There has been a massive shift within Sony, within PlayStation. The company no longer functions the same. It is inherently different. And of course, with that comes new policy, new leadership, and a whole lot of new information. Now we're actually going to cover that along with the PlayStation 5, and it all starts with Sony's Jim Ryan. Now some of you might not know this, but Jim Ryan is the CEO of PlayStation, and over the last 2 years, Sony have begun globalization. They are no longer a divided branch of a company. Before, you had Sony North America, Sony Japan, and oftentimes these two sides would clash. They would fight with one another. Well, it looks like the leadership there, the top brass at Sony, have all backed Jim Ryan, or at least most of them have, and he is now the CEO of PlayStation. I'm sure some of you guys have noticed that Sean Layden is gone. They drop-kicked him out the window. Shuhei is gone. He's working in a boiler room somewhere. I kid, of course. He actually took a demotion and is now basically heading up Sony's indie division. Look, the point is there's obviously a lot of things going on at Sony right now, and this globalization is pretty much one of the biggest factors. And I'm sure there's one or two of you right now saying, why are you rambling so much? Well, if you know, you know. And there's a reason I'm talking about these things before I get to the main topic. This new shift in mentality is the exact reason you are seeing everything you're seeing. The shift from a divided company to a unified one. New leadership in Jim Ryan, leadership I personally do not approve of. I mean, think about it. Top Sony brass promoted Jim Ryan to head of PlayStation, right? Now, keep in mind, this is a guy that said, who wants to play old games when asked about their competitors' ability to have backwards compatibility. Now, smack yourself in the face, do a double take, and remember that he was saying all of this while selling you PlayStation Now, as well as the PlayStation Classic. That's just one example, but the gist is, I don't really get a pro-consumer vibe from the guy. Hell, I don't even get a human vibe from the guy. I think Sony might have accidentally hired the T-1000 from Terminator 2, except for there is no John Connor. It's coming back to shoot all of your games. Well, all of your old games. Look, let me know if you're a fan of Jim Ryan. For now, let's go over this article. Let me know your thoughts as we go along. Let's get into it. Sony's Jim Ryan. We had to make changes to deliver our PlayStation 5 dream. Now, I will be summarizing a lot of this, but as always, I will link this down below. I'm going to go ahead and skip around to the most important parts, and we'll start with this. Now, when speaking about current hardcore PlayStation 4 gamers, Jim Ryan has this to say. As we move towards the next generation in 2020, one of our main tasks is to take that community and transition it from PlayStation 4 to PlayStation 5. He says, we need to do this at a scale and pace we've never delivered on before. Now, there's a ton of great stuff coming up in this article, but I want you to think about what that means. PlayStation are telling us that they need a higher adoption rate than they've ever had with any system before. They need more people to buy this thing at launch than ever, and by a wide margin. Does that sound like something a $500 system is likely to do? Also, when referring to scaling PlayStation 5's install base higher than ever, he is mostly talking about moving into new territories. There is much of the map still untapped. Sony are likely considering competitors that can leverage any 4G device, that can leverage hundreds of millions of customers with no problem. Now, from here, Jim Ryan proceeds to talk a bit about the PlayStation 5. He says, one thing that makes me me optimistic is what we're actually hearing from developers and publishers. They are speaking on the ease at which they are able to get code running on PlayStation 5. Apparently, developers are saying it's way beyond any experience they've ever had on any other PlayStation system. He says he's confident in what PS5 has to bring and that there is much more to announce beyond what they have already announced. He then follows that up by saying he's personally focused on the games that will make or break PlayStation 5. Jim Ryan says that development of PlayStation 5 production and feature sets are massively streamlined with this new model they have at Sony. Remember, they are now one united company. Everybody is working on the same problems instead of trying to do different things. Remember, this globalization can result in far less spending as well, especially in things like marketing, where they can develop one campaign and scale it where applicable. Though the article does note that Sony may lose some of their cultural flair in some of these areas where they dominate. When speaking about PS5 software, Jim Ryan says that they will not develop region-specific exclusives anymore, like they might have done several years back. Instead, they will let the indie market take care of those specific needs. I actually think that's a really good idea. Much smaller demand, much smaller studios, much smaller cost, much smaller risk. Whereas Sony themselves can keep focusing on those big budget blockbuster AAAs. I actually like that approach. As an Xbox dude, I would like to see more of those big budget blockbusters from Microsoft as well. Now, when speaking of the future of gaming, where things are going, will things even stay on PlayStation and the console alone? Well, of course not, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, when talking about change amongst both Sony and the gaming industry itself, Jim Ryan has this to say. I would say that our organizations and the way they work would, by definition, need to evolve to keep pace with the change in how people play games, how games are distributed, how games are made, the way games are consumed. After speaking about the cloud being one of the most relevant examples of this, he says everybody is in for a change, not just PlayStation. It's actually one of the great themes of this article. Now, when asked about different business models, being subscription, streaming, or otherwise, Jim Ryan had this to say. And the very first sentence is quite telling, and I quote, "Yes, there are many questions where we don't have the answer yet. But I continue to be immensely optimistic because we also do have very strong core assets in our locker. The brand, the content, and the community. While Stadia is starting relatively fresh, Sony have been around for quite some time. On the other hand, Microsoft do have quite a bit built up in terms of infrastructure, user base, and more. But they are also launching Project xCloud, so it'll be very interesting to see how that goes." Now, when it comes to this next part, pay very close attention to Jim Ryan's words. Reread them. This part in particular is generating a bit of controversy, mainly due to the fact that most people read a headline and didn't actually read the article. Many are claiming that Jim Ryan said PS Now would never receive day-and-date first-party titles on PS5, PS4, and that's just not the case. In fact, there is some very strategic wording here for the exact opposite reason. When talking about PlayStation Now, Jim Ryan says we are taking this seriously. He's talking about price cuts, marketing, and of course software. He says we had an important inflection point earlier this year when we were able to bring the last 7 data centers online for Scandinavia, Italy, and Spain. This enabled blanket coverage for PlayStation Now across Western Europe. Now, he says that this was a complete game changer and essentially a green light to really push PlayStation Now like they really wanted to the whole time. He says before that point he was nervous talking too much about a service like PlayStation Now with a German player being able to enjoy the service, but an Italian player not being able to enjoy the service. So he says when switching on the lights of those new data centers, it was a big deal. And only when they got to the point where they had the whole of Western Europe available for PlayStation Now, when nobody was left out in the region, could they really start to take this seriously. He also confirmed that they hit 1 million PlayStation Now users, roughly 50% boost from including exclusive software like God of War and Uncharted 4, along with, of course, those price cuts. Now, this is the part people really need to focus on. When asked about putting first-party software into PlayStation Now day and date, much like Microsoft do, something that's actually really pro-consumer, Jim Ryan says the following, and his first few words alone are quite telling. It's an area that is fast changing and fluid. The nature and scale of some of the first-party games that we are working on leads us to think that, quote, right now, unquote, it's better to spend energy on making sure that the launch of those games is a massive entertainment event. I would cite God of War, Spider-Man, and The Last of Us 2 next year to fall into this category. Here's another massive part of the quote people forgot to read. You know, the people that said Sony shut them down. He continues, that's where we stand right now. But our stance on the inclusion of first party in PlayStation Now in terms of what we've done this month is very different from our stance 12 months ago. A mere 12 months ago, fellas. He continues to deconstruct the argument of many out there. He says, I don't want to say this is what PlayStation Now is going to be like forever, but certainly right now. I mean, let me say it in a different way that means the exact same thing. I mean, I certainly don't want to say we're not going to do it, just not right now. Again, it's pretty obvious what they're going to do here. Now, oddly enough, he says that he wants the launch of their first party to be clean and pure. I mean, that's some weird stuff, but if you're paying attention to developers that are in Game Pass, those that are saying it quadrupled our sales, Microsoft are saying that our games sell more when they're in Game Pass. I mean, there's a ton of data, and eventually that data will stack high enough. Sony will pay more attention. They are already paying more attention. They really enjoyed that 50% boost to subscriber base on PlayStation Now over the past month. Some of you have to keep in mind that with subscriptions like PlayStation Now and Game Pass, you're not taking your games out of stores. They are still in the stores. You still have every option to buy them that way. But of course, if you're a fan of something like Netflix or Hulu, you understand the convenience of something like PS Now or Game Pass. All of the same logic applies in terms of supporting the content. You're not playing their games for free. Developers still get paid for putting their content in services like Game Pass and PlayStation Now on top of those additional revenue streams, and developers are talking about how much more they're selling on top of those extra revenue streams. Problem is, people use obscure charts from PlayStation dominated regions that represent 1% of all physical sales, not even total sales, to try to prove that Game Pass is actually destroying all kinds of traction and profit, when in reality you do not have a source that shows how much money they made versus this or that, given whatever model they might have chosen. The only thing we do have is countless interview after countless interview of developers in Game Pass talking about how their games sold 4 times more, 2 times more, 10 times the engagement, as well as Microsoft saying that Game Pass actually increases revenue, sales, and more. That is the information we have on how Game Pass is affecting developers. Again, even if a title does sell less, they are being paid for their content. They are being compensated. They know what they're doing. And on top of all of that, you should be more worried about you and how you benefit, the flexibility and value that that could bring to you, provided you want to rent those games. If you don't, then buy them as you always have. And with that, I have to apologize. I really digressed quite hard there. I know some of you aren't aware of this, but the amount of misinformation about something like Game Pass or PlayStation Now killing the industry is insane. Profit is actually what powers game development, and traditionally sales have always been what powers profit. But in case you couldn't tell, times have changed. Developers get paid just to put something in a service. Do they have to take their game off the shelf or out of the digital store? No, they do not. It's simply another revenue stream, and if they decide it's worth it, which so far pretty much every developer has said it is, then I think they probably know better than some people that don't want an exclusive in a service. But hey, I digress, of course. Let me know your thoughts on that down below. And long story longer on this article, Jim Ryan also confirms that, hey, yeah, of course we're looking for new studios, but you gotta be very careful. Hey, stuff's expensive, blah, blah, blah. Look, at the end of the day, I think it's really cool that developers find PlayStation 5 easier to code for than any PlayStation ever. If you remember, PlayStation 4 was quite a developer-friendly console, pretty easy to develop for. This could also reflect on Project Scarlet. Could Scarlet be even easier to develop for than PlayStation 5? Maybe they'll be the same, maybe they won't. And though many of you might have overlooked this and say, hey, yeah, it's common sense, Jim Ryan speaking on pretty much maximum market penetration is, hey, that's really a sign to me. Yet another sign that PS5 will target $399. Now, some of you are like, duh, but I get the comment all the time that that thing will be $500. I even get $700 and beyond. Some people say, well, you know what, I'm shooting for the moon. It's also really interesting to see everything that has changed with Sony here lately. Now, one united company instead of a divided mess. Apparently, this will make things easier. They are able to streamline production and feature sets for PlayStation 5 as well. Let me know your thoughts on that. So at the end of the day, yes, I know this is a very long video. Trust me, I prefer to make the 5-6 minute videos way more than these. But I do appreciate it, guys. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for checking it out. Do me a favor, hit that like button. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts on these things. And of course, check those sources, links down below. There's a Patreon if you want to support the channel. You can hit the join button. You can even buy a shirt. There's several ways that you can support. Again, guys, thank you so much for what you do. I'll be in the comments. I'm Dealer. I'm out.